Hi guys, tonight we'll step quietly into the world of a wartime nurse on the front lines, where exhaustion, courage, and the constant rhythm of care shaped every single day. You'll hear about bandaged wounds under flickering lamps, whispered reassurances in the chaos, and the heavy silence that came after the battles. This is not just history, it's a window into what it truly felt like to stand between life and loss. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. The first light of dawn often came not with birdsong, but with the distant echo of artillery, a reminder that sleep, when it came at all, was fragile and short. For a nurse, the day began even before the sun had properly risen, because the wounded never followed a clock. The air carried a chill, mixed with the scent of damp earth and antiseptic, and the sound of boots hurried past the tents. There was always a sense of waiting, as if the horizon itself was holding its breath, unsure of what the next hour would bring. Stepping into the makeshift ward, the canvas walls swayed with each gust of wind, and the rows of cots stretched farther than seemed possible. Every bed told a story, some with fresh bandages still bright against pale skin, others with eyes closed in restless dreams. Nurses moved quietly, balancing the urgency of their tasks with the need to keep the atmosphere calm, because panic spread faster than infection. In one corner, a soldier gripped a small photograph. His knuckles white as a nurse gently changed the dressing on his arm. In another, the murmur of prayer slipped into the air as someone fought to stay awake. The tools of care were simple, sometimes painfully so. Gauze that had to be boiled and reused, morphine rationed with precision, water carried in heavy buckets when supplies ran low. Yet, with steady hands and quiet words, the nurses created a fragile kind of order amid the surrounding storm. Meals were hurried, often just a piece of bread and a sip of weak coffee, but even those few moments of pause carried weight. Sitting for a minute, listening to the hum of conversation between the wounded, a nurse could almost forget the thunder outside. Almost. But the reprieve never lasted long. The rumble of trucks would soon bring in a new wave of stretchers, mud-streaked and heavy with blood, and the day would stretch on again. Training had taught them to be efficient, but nothing could prepare for the human weight of it all. The way a young man's voice would falter as he asked if his family had been notified, or the way another would force a smile despite the pain, trying to shield others from his fear. The frontline hospital was never quiet, not truly. Even in the rare lulls there was the sound of breathing, of shifting in cots, of nurses' footsteps moving steadily down the rows. The rhythm became a strange kind of music, one that spoke of persistence. Each nurse carried her own silent rituals. One tied her apron with deliberate care, as if neatness gave her strength. Another kept a sprig of lavender tucked into her pocket, a small reminder of home. These small acts were anchors, steadying them in the unsteady world around them. As the day deepened, the lines between hours blurred. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canvas, replaced eventually by the dim glow of lanterns. Shadows grew long, and still the work continued, checking pulses, cleaning wounds, offering a sip of water, pressing a cloth against a fevered forehead. It was endless, yet every action mattered. In those quiet gestures lives were held together, and through it all the nurses rarely spoke of fear. Instead, they learned to move as part of the rhythm, to let their compassion become the constant thread that tied the chaos into something bearable. For those who lay on the cots, it was often the presence of a calm hand, a soft word or a smile in the darkest moment that lingered most strongly in memory. And for the nurses themselves, it was the knowledge that even on the worst days, they had given what comfort they could, standing firm in a place where fragility and strength were one and the same. The rhythm of the ward never truly stopped, even when the battlefield grew quiet for a moment. Nurses learned to pace themselves, saving strength for the rushes that always seemed to arrive just as exhaustion pressed hardest. The evenings carried their own challenges, not of heavy gunfire, but of tending wounds that had already been treated once, and now demanded patience more than speed. It was a different kind of fatigue, one that pressed down like a weight across the shoulders. As lanterns flickered, shadows stretched across the canvas walls, and the ward took on a hushed atmosphere. The men often spoke more at night, perhaps because darkness brought thoughts of home more sharply into focus. Some whispered about farms and families, about wives or sweethearts waiting far away. Others spoke in half-sentences, drifting in and out of drowsy consciousness. For the nurses, listening became as important as stitching or bandaging. A few words offered in the right moment could ease pain just as surely as medicine. Sleep for the nurses came in fragments, stolen between rounds. A narrow cot in a corner offered little comfort, but it was enough for an hour or two, enough to close tired eyes and pretend for a moment that silence meant peace instead of anticipation. The sound that always pulled them back was not loud, the creak of a stretcher being carried in, or the hoarse whisper of a patient calling for water. Instantly the nurse would be awake, her body moving before her mind had fully caught up. Supplies were always a concern, and evenings were often spent checking and rechecking the dwindling stores. Bottles of antiseptic lined up in neat rows, rolls of bandage stacked carefully, syringes boiled and dried again and again. Every item had to stretch farther than it was meant to. There was no room for waste, no comfort in plenty. The nurses adapted, creating solutions from whatever they had at hand, their creativity as vital as their medical knowledge. There was also the unspoken bond among the staff. A glance across the ward, a brief nod, was enough to communicate what needed to be done. They relied on each other not only for efficiency but for emotional strength. When one faltered, another quietly stepped forward. No one lingered long in weakness, because the next patient was always waiting. Outside, the night hummed with distant sounds. Boots on gravel, the low murmur of soldiers guarding the perimeter, the faraway rumble of engines. It was a reminder that the war never truly rested, even if the guns had gone silent for a few hours. Inside, the lantern light painted every face with soft gold, and the nurses' movements became steady silhouettes against the glow. In the quiet, it was easy to forget the larger chaos, to focus only on the immediate, the tightening of a bandage, the cool cloth against a burning forehead, the whispered reassurance given to someone who could not sleep. The hours of night blurred into one another, marked only by the gradual fading of lanterns and the pale grey light of dawn creeping through the canvas. Another day would begin soon, and with it, another rush of stretchers, another wave of wounds to tend. But for the moment, in those fragile hours of stillness, the frontline nurse found herself suspended between exhaustion and duty, carrying the weight of countless lives in her steady, quiet hands. Morning on the front lines arrived not with calm birdsong, but with the distant groan of engines and the muffled roar of artillery. For the nurses, dawn meant another cycle of relentless work. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of mud, sweat and disinfectant. There was no time to stretch or linger. Patients stirred restlessly, and new arrivals were already being carried in. The cots filled quickly, each one demanding attention, each life fragile in its own way. The first tasks of the day were practical, changing dressings stiff with dried blood, checking pulses that fluttered unevenly, easing water between parched lips. Yet behind every action lay a quiet understanding. Some of these men would not see another dawn. The nurses knew it, though they rarely let it show. Their calm expressions were part of the medicine they offered, a shield that kept despair at bay. In these early hours the ward was alive with small sounds, the scrape of a stool against the ground, the rustle of cloth, the faint groan as a bandage was tightened. Conversation was muted, almost reverent. Soldiers often reached for a hand to hold as they braced for pain, and the nurses gave that hand without hesitation, steady and firm. Beyond the walls the day's battles unfolded, but inside the focus was always on the single life before them. Food, when it came, was simple, a crust of bread, perhaps a sip of broth. But even this was shared among the nurses when supplies were thin. They learned to take strength from the smallest things. A moment of laughter between colleagues, a letter read aloud from home, the flicker of gratitude in a patient's eyes. These fragments of humanity kept them going when their own energy seemed to drain away. By midday the ward grew hotter, the air thick and difficult to breathe. Flies hovered where they could, drawn to the scent of open wounds, and the nurses swatted them away with practised ease. Sweat ran beneath their uniforms, but they worked on, sleeves rolled high, faces set with quiet determination. They had long since stopped thinking of comfort. What mattered was keeping the rhythm, tend, clean, reassure, move to the next. Each soldier was someone's son, brother or husband, and the nurses treated them as such, offering dignity alongside care. Occasionally a brief pause allowed them to step outside, to breathe air that was fresher than the closed, stifling ward. The landscape around them was scarred, mud churned by wheels, smoke drifting low across the horizon. But even this view gave a moment of perspective. Standing there, the nurse could feel the weight of both the war and her place in it. Not fighting with weapons, but holding the line in another way, preserving life where so much was being taken. Then the call would come again, and she would return inside to the steady rhythm of duty, to the countless quiet acts that defined her days on the front. The afternoon brought with it a relentless heat that seemed to cling to everything. The canvas walls of the ward, the cots lined shoulder to shoulder, even the skin of those who worked within. Nurses moved steadily through the haze, their aprons damp with sweat, their hands never still. The rhythm of care continued. Change the dressing, wipe the fevered brow, whisper a word of encouragement. Every movement carried weight, because even the smallest gesture could mean the difference between despair and hope. The patients, worn thin by pain and fear, often clung to those fragments of comfort. A soldier might smile faintly after being given a sip of water, or relax at the sound of a calm voice telling him he was safe, at least for the moment. Supplies thinned quickly in the heat. Bandages had to be boiled and dried in the sun before they could be used again, and nurses often found themselves recutting scraps of cloth to make do. The antiseptic smell was sharp and constant, mingling with the earthy scent of mud carried in on boots and stretchers. Morphine was rationed carefully, saved for the worst of the worst, and every dose was weighed against what might come later. The nurses felt the pressure of those decisions deeply, though they rarely spoke of it. Outside, the world offered no relief. The rumble of artillery was never far, sometimes low and distant, sometimes close enough to rattle the metal trays on the tables. Dust settled on everything, carried in through every gap in the canvas. Even the moments of stillness were heavy with the knowledge that another wave of wounded could arrive at any second. And so the nurses learned to breathe through the waiting, to steady themselves in preparation. By late afternoon, exhaustion began to creep in. Shoulders ached from lifting, eyes burned from the strain of focusing in dim light, and hands carried the memory of countless wounds touched and treated. Yet there was no pause. The ward did not recognize fatigue, and the nurses had long since trained themselves to push past it. The bond among them was a quiet salvation. A glance or a nod was enough to share strength. One nurse might slip another a crust of bread, or pour a quick sip of coffee into a tin mug before moving on. These silent gestures wove them together, creating an unspoken network of support. Toward evening the light softened, painting the ward in gold, and for a fleeting moment the air felt almost gentle. Soldiers spoke more freely then, their words carrying stories of home, fields, rivers, children's laughter. The nurses listened, offering space for memories that seemed to lift the weight of the war, if only briefly. Then the stretchers came again, carried in on weary shoulders, and the rhythm of urgency returned. The nurses braced themselves, ready to begin once more, because the day was far from over, and their place on the front lines allowed no rest. Evening settled over the camp like a heavy blanket, dimming the sounds of battle without erasing them entirely. Inside the ward the lanterns were lit one by one, their glow flickering against the canvas walls. The change in light did not bring an end to the work. It only shifted the pace. The air grew cooler, but the tasks remained the same: checking pulses, rinsing wounds, keeping fevers at bay. For the nurses, nightfall was less about rest and more about endurance. Patients often grew restless in the dark, their pain sharper, their memories more vivid. Some whispered in their sleep, fragments of home or fragments of fear, while others reached out blindly, searching for a steadying hand. The nurses answered each call, bending close to murmur reassurance or simply to listen. The gift of presence was sometimes as powerful as any medicine they could give. In those hours, the ward seemed suspended in a fragile silence, broken only by low groans, the drip of water, or the scrape of a stool being pulled closer to a bedside. The lantern light softened every face, making the room feel almost otherworldly. Yet just beyond the canvas, the world of war continued. The thud of boots, the muted voices of sentries, the distant rumble of engines moving supplies to the front. Sleep for the nurses came in fragments, often interrupted before it could deepen. A single hour on a narrow cot was enough to restore just enough strength to rise again. They grew used to waking at the faintest sound, their bodies trained to respond before their minds had fully cleared the fog of fatigue. It was not rest in the true sense, but it was survival. Between rounds, they checked supplies again, counting bottles of antiseptic, stacking bandages, making notes of what was almost gone. The shortages pressed hardest at night, when there was no chance of a delivery until morning. Improvisation became second nature. Cloth repurposed as slings, herbs steeped in water to soothe burns, makeshift splints carved from whatever wood could be found. In these small acts of resourcefulness, the nurses carved out a kind of resilience that kept the ward functioning against impossible odds. The camaraderie among them was strongest during the night shifts. A quiet nod of thanks, a brief smile shared in the lamplight, became lifelines of their own. There was no room for despair when so many depended on them, and so they leaned on one another in subtle, unspoken ways. As the hours dragged toward dawn, the nurses held fast to that rhythm, moving, tending, comforting, knowing that the work would never truly pause. The war outside might surge or still, but within the ward their mission remained constant: to preserve life, to ease pain, to offer humanity where it was nearly lost. In that steady devotion, they found a strength that carried them through the endless nights. Dawn returned with a pale, grey light that slipped through the cracks of the canvas walls, pulling the nurses back into another cycle of work before they had truly rested. The night had left its mark on everyone. Patients stirred uneasily, some muttering in their sleep, others jolting awake at the faintest sound. For the nurses, the morning began not with food or warmth, but with movement. Wash basins carried in, bandages unwrapped, medicines counted and rationed again. The air was sharp with the mingling scents of iodine and damp earth, and the hum of activity grew steadily louder. Each cot presented its own challenge. A fever that had risen overnight, a wound that refused to close, a young man too weak to lift his head yet determined to ask about his comrades. The nurses moved from bed to bed with practised calm, speaking softly, adjusting pillows, pressing cloths against burns or tightening dressings against bleeding. Their voices, steady and gentle, became anchors for men adrift in pain and fear. Outside, the war pressed closer. Trucks rumbled by, carrying supplies toward the front, while orders were barked across the camp. Occasionally the ground trembled faintly under distant shell fire. Those reminders seeped into the ward, but inside the nurses held fast to their own rhythm, refusing to let the violence dictate their care. They created a fragile island of steadiness, one stitch, one bandage, one whispered reassurance at a time. Meals were taken in passing, bread dipped quickly into lukewarm broth, a sip of weak coffee swallowed before another stretcher appeared at the entrance. Hunger became background noise, easily ignored when compared to the cries of the wounded. What mattered more than food was endurance, the ability to keep moving, to keep hands steady despite fatigue. By midday, the ward felt heavy with heat again. Flies returned, buzzing insistently despite every effort to chase them away. The nurses tied their hair back tighter, rolled up sleeves, and pressed on. Their aprons bore stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove, badges of work done without pause. Yet beneath the weight of exhaustion, there was also a quiet pride. Each life saved, each pain eased, was a small victory claimed against the overwhelming tide of war. Occasionally a nurse would step outside for a moment, not for rest, but for air. The world beyond the ward was scarred. Mud tracks from wagons, lines of weary men marching past, smoke smudging the horizon. But even this brief view gave perspective. It reminded them that their work was not hidden or forgotten. It was part of something vast, a thread in the fabric of survival. As the sun climbed higher, the day showed no sign of slowing. The nurses braced themselves for what was coming, their steps sure, their expressions calm. They had long since learned that there was no choice but to continue. And so they did, carrying both the weight of the war and the quiet strength that allowed them to face another unending day. The afternoon settled in with a dry, pressing heat that seemed to smother the ward beneath its canvas roof. The air inside grew thick and stifling, filled with the mingled smells of disinfectant, sweat, and earth carried in on boots. The nurses worked through it with quiet persistence, their sleeves rolled high, their faces streaked with fatigue but never faltering. Every cot demanded something different, a bandage to change, a wound to clean, a whispered reassurance to offer. The rhythm became almost mechanical, yet behind each gesture was a depth of care that gave the work its meaning. By now, the soldiers who had been in the ward for days began to speak more openly. Some told small stories of home, fields left untended, sisters waiting, letters unread. Others clung to silence, retreating into themselves as the pain or memories weighed too heavily to share. The nurses listened when words came and respected the quiet when they did not. Their presence alone was often enough, a steady figure in a world that had lost so much steadiness. Supplies ran thin again, and improvisation filled the gaps. A strip of cloth cut from a worn shirt became a sling. Boiled water poured into tin cups served as both medicine and comfort. These small acts of ingenuity became second nature. No one questioned the scarcity anymore. Instead, they adapted, knowing that resourcefulness was as necessary as skill. Outside, the sky shimmered with heat, and the faint thunder of distant artillery pulsed in the air. Occasionally a stretcher arrived, carried by soldiers whose uniforms were streaked with mud and dust. The nurses moved quickly to receive each one, clearing space, setting hands to work without hesitation. There was no room for fear in these moments, only the unbroken chain of action. Assess, tend, stabilize. As the hours stretched on, fatigue pressed harder. Muscles ached, and eyes blurred with the strain of constant focus, yet the nurses carried on. Among themselves they shared quiet signals of support. A nod, a brief smile, a cup of water passed into waiting hands. These small exchanges kept them upright, as vital in their own way as food or rest. Toward evening, the light softened, spilling golden through the gaps in the canvas. The ward, though still full of suffering, seemed gentler in that glow. The men spoke more softly, and some even laughed faintly at shared memories. The nurses paused, if only for a breath, to listen, allowing the sound of laughter to settle into their own hearts. It reminded them of what they were working for, not only survival, but the fragments of humanity that could still shine even in the darkest places. The respite was brief, but it was enough to carry them forward, ready for the long night that was sure to come. As night approached once again, the ward shifted into a slower but no less demanding rhythm. Lanterns were lit and placed carefully along the rows of cots, their glow flickering softly against the canvas walls. The shadows moved with every step of the nurses, tall silhouettes bending over the wounded, steady hands guiding cloth and needle. The air cooled slightly, but exhaustion clung just as heavily as the heat had in the afternoon. For many of the soldiers, night time was the most difficult part of the day. Pain seemed sharper in the dark, and memories surfaced more vividly. Some muttered in their sleep, haunted by fragments of the battlefield. Others lay awake, staring into the dim light, asking quiet questions about whether they would ever see home again. The nurses answered with calm certainty, even when their own hearts carried doubt. A steady voice and a reassuring touch were often the only shields these men had against despair. Supplies were checked again and again. Bandages were stacked neatly, bottles of iodine lined up in precise rows, and what little morphine remained was guarded with careful hands. The shortages weighed on everyone, but the nurses refused to let it show. Improvisation was their constant companion. A strip of cloth repurposed, water boiled to sterilize, pillows fashioned out of folded coats. Each small solution carried the same goal: to preserve dignity and ease suffering where possible. During the quietest hours, the bond among the nurses grew stronger. They exchanged brief smiles across the ward, or a nod that said without words, "I see your tiredness, and I share it." These silent acts of solidarity were lifelines, invisible threads holding them upright. No one could endure this work alone, and they knew it. Outside, the night hummed faintly with distant activity. Boots crunching gravel, trucks moving supplies, low voices carrying orders. Sometimes the sound of artillery reached even here, a dull thud against the silence. But inside the ward, the nurses created a fragile sanctuary. Their movements were steady, their voices calm, their presence constant. It was a quiet defiance against the chaos pressing at the edges. Toward midnight, fatigue became nearly unbearable. Eyes burned from strain, hands trembled from endless motion, and yet the work continued. A soldier called for water, another needed a dressing tightened. The nurses responded without hesitation, each action flowing into the next. There was no room to stop, no luxury of collapse. Their strength was not found in great bursts, but in the countless small moments of persistence. As the night stretched on, they held to the rhythm: breathe, move, tend, comfort. And in that rhythm, fragile though it was, they carried both themselves and those who depended on them into another uncertain dawn. The dawn of a new day arrived quietly, with only a faint grey light seeping through the worn canvas walls. For the nurses, morning did not bring renewal so much as continuation. They rose from narrow cots with stiff limbs, splashed cold water on tired faces, and tied their aprons with practised motions. The ward was already alive with sound. The low murmur of men stirring in pain, the scrape of boots as orderlies carried in water, the distant growl of engines signalling more wounded on their way. The first rounds of the morning were always the most demanding. Dressings that had held through the night needed to be removed, cleaned and replaced. Fevers that had smouldered in the dark required fresh cloths soaked in water, pressed gently against burning skin. Some patients asked softly for news, about battles, about comrades, about letters that might arrive. The nurses rarely had answers, but they offered comfort in the steadiness of their voices, in the calmness of their presence. Outside, the world was scarred and restless. Trucks rolled past, wheels grinding deep into the mud, while soldiers hurried by with expressions set in grim determination. Occasionally the rumble of artillery shook the ground beneath the ward, a reminder that the day ahead would bring more casualties. The nurses felt the weight of that truth, though they did not speak it aloud. Inside, their task was to focus on the here and now. The soldier with the wounded leg, the one coughing through the night, the one too weak to sit up but still trying to smile. Food came late and was sparse. A piece of stale bread, dipped quickly into thin broth, passed from hand to hand. The nurses learned to eat quickly, not knowing when they would next have the chance. Hunger became an accepted companion, tucked away like fatigue, something to be endured quietly for the sake of the work. By midday, the ward was crowded once more. Stretchers arrived in waves, the groans of pain mixing with shouted orders. The nurses moved swiftly, guiding orderlies, clearing space, bending low over fresh wounds. Their hands were steady, their voices calm, even as exhaustion gnawed at every muscle. They did not allow panic to enter, for they knew that their composure was part of the healing. The hours stretched on, the rhythm unbroken. Tend, clean, reassure, move forward. And though the day was endless, each small act carried meaning. Each soldier comforted, each wound tended, each breath eased. For the nurses, this was the heart of their work. Not only the saving of the lives, but the giving of strength to endure one more day on the unforgiving front. The afternoon pressed heavily upon the ward, its heat mingling with the already thick air of antiseptic and sweat. The canvas walls trapped every sound, the soft groans of patients, the clatter of trays, the steady shuffle of weary footsteps. For the nurses, the hours blurred together, a cycle of tending and moving, their bodies acting almost from memory. Yet within that routine, each patient remained unique, each life deserving of care. One soldier clutched a letter from home, its edges worn thin from constant handling. Another whispered a name over and over, as though speaking it might bridge the distance across continents. The nurses listened when they could, their ears attuned not only to symptoms, but to the fragile thread of human need woven through every bed. Supplies dwindled quickly under the weight of demand. Bandages were cut thinner, antiseptic stretched drop by drop. Morphine was rationed with agonizing precision, each dose a decision that weighed heavily. The nurses carried these choices silently, never letting the men see the conflict behind their calm expressions. Improvisation became an art. Slings from old fabric, splints carved from scrap wood, pillows fashioned from folded coats. Outside, the thunder of artillery grew closer, shaking the ground in dull tremors. Dust drifted into the ward with each gust of wind, coating every surface. The war pressed at the edges of their fragile refuge, yet inside the nurses created a rhythm of steadiness. Their movements were deliberate, their voices low and soothing, their hands unshaken even when fatigue threatened to overwhelm them. Food came late, as always. A tin cup of lukewarm broth, a scrap of bread shared quickly before another stretcher was carried in. Hunger was forgotten in the face of duty, replaced by the need to keep going, to keep answering the endless calls for help. Among the nurses, a quiet bond grew stronger. A brief smile exchanged over a patient's bed, a nod of understanding, a hand brushing against another in silent encouragement. These gestures carried as much weight as rest. They leaned on each other in subtle ways, finding strength not in words but in presence. As evening drew near, the light slanted golden through the gaps in the canvas, softening the harsh lines of the ward. The soldiers, weary from both battle and recovery, spoke more gently in those hours, sometimes even managing a faint laugh. The nurses listened, letting those fragments of humanity linger in their own hearts. Then the stretchers arrived again, the silence broken by groans and hurried footsteps. The rhythm of urgency returned, and the nurses braced themselves, sleeves rolled, hands steady, ready once more to meet the endless tide of need that defined their days. Night fell over the camp with a chill that seeped through the thin canvas, bringing with it a different kind of weight. Inside the ward, lanterns glowed dimly, their flames swaying in the draught. The air felt quieter, yet the work did not slow. If anything, the night revealed new challenges. Patients grew restless in the darkness, fevers often climbed higher, and the fear of the unknown pressed more heavily on tired minds. Nurses moved softly between the rows, their footsteps barely audible, their hands steady even when their bodies trembled with fatigue. The wounded called out in whispers, some lost in dreams, others caught in memories too vivid to ignore. One muttered names as though speaking to loved ones far away, while another pleaded for reassurance he would live to see morning. The nurses bent close, their voices calm and low, promising safety in the only way they could. Sometimes, comfort meant nothing more than holding a hand until sleep finally returned. Supplies were counted again, every bottle and bandage checked and stretched. By lantern light, the nurses stitched torn fabric into makeshift supports, boiled water for sterilization, and repurposed whatever could be spared. Resourcefulness was as important as skill, and necessity taught them to find solutions where none seemed possible. These small acts of ingenuity kept the ward functioning, even when shortages pressed unbearably. In the stillness of midnight, the bond among the nurses deepened. A glance across the room, a quiet nod, or the passing of a tin cup filled with weak coffee carried meaning greater than words. They leaned on each other silently, each woman recognizing in the other the same exhaustion, the same determination. This shared understanding was a lifeline, holding them together when the hours felt endless. Outside, the war never truly slept. Boots crunched on gravel, guards spoke in hushed tones, and the occasional boom of distant artillery rolled across the earth. These sounds seeped into the ward, reminders that danger was never far. Yet within the lantern-lit space, the nurses created a fragile sanctuary, their presence a steadying force against the world's chaos. As dawn crept closer, fatigue became almost unbearable. Muscles ached, eyes burned, and every step felt heavier. Still, they answered each call. A sip of water, a cloth against fever, a bandage tightened just enough. Their strength was not in dramatic bursts, but in the quiet persistence that carried them from one moment to the next. And so the night passed, not in silence, but in the soft, unbroken rhythm of care that defined life on the front lines. Morning arrived once more, pale light spilling into the ward and pushing back the dim glow of lanterns. The nurses rose from their brief rest with weary limbs, their aprons tied quickly as the first demands of the day called them forward. The ward carried the familiar chorus of sounds: coughing, the creak of cots, the low murmur of men waking in pain. The day began not with calm but with urgency, as stretchers were carried in almost immediately fresh from the battlefield. Each patient was a new story, some silent with shock, others groaning through clenched teeth, all needing attention at once. The nurses moved quickly, sleeves rolled high, their hands steady despite the exhaustion that clung to them. The rhythm of morning care began again, cleaning wounds, changing bandages, offering sips of water. Their calm voices anchored the chaos, reminding the men that they were not alone. Outside, the engines of trucks rumbled past, carrying supplies forward, while the distant thunder of artillery echoed like an unending drum. The war pressed close, its presence undeniable, yet the nurses focused only on the lives before them. To them, each soldier was not just part of the conflict, but a person to be seen, soothed, and given dignity. Food came late and was spare as always. A crust of bread, a sip of thin broth, passed quickly from hand to hand. Hunger faded into the background, ignored for the sake of work. What mattered was conserving energy, not satisfying appetite. Among the nurses, quiet encouragement flowed in small gestures. One offered another a brief smile, another handed over her cup of water without words. These unspoken exchanges were enough to remind each of them that they carried the burden together. By midday, the ward grew heavy with heat. Flies buzzed persistently, and the air grew thick with the mingling smells of antiseptic and sweat. The nurses worked on without pause, blotting brows, checking pulses, keeping despair from settling in. Their strength was measured not in dramatic displays, but in the countless small actions that held the fragile line between life and loss. Occasionally a soldier would share a memory of home, fields stretching green, the laughter of children, the sound of church bells on a Sunday morning. The nurses listened, letting those images carry them away for a heartbeat, before returning to the immediacy of their tasks. Those brief stories were a gift, fragments of peace carried into the heart of war. As the sun climbed higher, the work did not relent. More stretchers arrived, more wounds demanded care, and the nurses pressed forward with the same quiet persistence. Their strength lay not in grand gestures, but in the steady rhythm that carried them through each unending day on the front. The afternoon sun hung low, casting a harsh glow over the camp and filtering through the canvas walls of the ward. Inside, the heat thickened, wrapping itself around every breath. Nurses moved through it with practiced calm, their sleeves damp with sweat, their hands steady despite the weariness etched into their faces. The work was relentless, but each gesture, pressing a cloth to a fevered brow, adjusting a sling, checking a pulse, held meaning. Every patient was more than a case. He was a life balance between suffering and survival. The ward filled with soft voices. Some soldiers whispered memories of home, describing hills, farms, or city streets with a detail sharpened by distance. Others asked quietly about their comrades, hoping for reassurance, even when answers were uncertain. The nurses listened, offering comfort not through promises but through presence. Their calm became a shield, giving men something solid to hold on to when fear pressed in. Supplies were checked constantly, though there was never enough. Bandages were cut smaller, antiseptic poured sparingly, every drop measured with care. A single vial of morphine became a treasure to be rationed only when truly necessary. The weight of those decisions rested heavily on the nurses, but they carried it silently, their faces never betraying the conflict inside. Improvisation was constant, slings crafted from strips of fabric, splints carved from crates, pillows made of folded uniforms. These acts of adaptation became second nature, a quiet resistance against the limitations they faced. Outside, the war rumbled on. Engines groaned, boots struck the earth in hurried rhythm, and the occasional tremor of artillery shook dust from the rafters. Yet inside, the nurses carved out a fragile refuge. Their movements were steady, their words quiet, their care unbroken. They could not silence the world beyond, but they could shape the space within into something that felt almost safe. Hunger returned in the late hours, a dull ache in the stomach, but food was again scarce. A piece of bread passed between two nurses, a sip of broth shared quickly, enough to push them forward. Fatigue pressed against their bodies, but the rhythm of duty carried them beyond it. They leaned on one another in subtle ways, a hand brushing against another, a brief glance that said, "I am with you." As the day stretched into evening, the golden light softened the ward, bathing faces in warmth that felt almost gentle. The men spoke more freely then, and sometimes laughter rose faintly above the quiet. The nurses paused, if only for a moment, letting that sound settle into their hearts. It reminded them why they endured, not just to preserve life, but to protect these fragile sparks of humanity against the shadow of war. Evening crept across the camp, the sky outside fading into a bruised mix of purple and grey. Inside the ward, lanterns were lit, their flames flickering as shadows stretched long across the canvas walls. The heat of the day eased, replaced by a damp chill that settled into bones already weary. The nurses adjusted shawls or tied aprons tighter, but their hands never slowed. Night was not a pause. It was simply another chapter in the same unending rhythm of care. Patients shifted uneasily as darkness grew. Some groaned in their sleep, reliving moments of battle that played over in restless dreams. Others stared silently into the dim glow, eyes wide and searching for something steady. The nurses bent close, offering words in soft tones, the kind that seemed to steady not only the wounded but also themselves. A calm presence in the night was as much a medicine as bandages or water. Supplies were again a constant concern. The nurses boiled what cloth they could salvage, stitched pieces together to create bandages, and rationed every drop of iodine. Morphine, nearly gone, was reserved for those whose pain was most unbearable. Each decision carried a silent weight, yet the women bore it with quiet determination. Their ingenuity was born not of choice but necessity, and it kept the ward alive through shortages that might have broken lesser spirits. Between tasks, the bond among the nurses deepened. One offered another a quick sip of water, another brushed a strand of hair from a tired face. These gestures spoke more than words ever could. They had learned to read each other's exhaustion, to offer strength in the smallest ways. No one complained. They simply carried on together. Outside, the camp stirred with its own rhythm. The crunch of boots on gravel, the distant bark of orders, the far-off thud of artillery reminded everyone that the war pressed close. But within the canvas walls, the ward became a fragile island of steadiness. The nurses' voices, steady and measured, wove a thin veil of calm over the constant noise of conflict. Toward midnight, fatigue pressed harder. Muscles ached, hands trembled, yet the work did not stop. A soldier called for water, another needed a dressing changed, and the nurses answered, their movements unbroken. Sleep came in fragments, snatched between rounds, never long enough but just enough to keep going. As the lanterns burned low and the night dragged on, the rhythm of the ward persisted, gentle, steady, unwavering. And in that rhythm, fragile lives were held, one quiet moment at a time. Dawn seeped into the ward with a pale, colourless light that revealed the weariness etched into every face. The nurses rose from narrow cots with stiff joints and tired eyes, tying their aprons as the first cries of pain signalled another day had begun. The morning brought no true sense of renewal, only the continuation of duty, the familiar cycle of tending to wounds, easing fevers, and listening to voices softened by fatigue. Outside, trucks rattled by, carrying supplies forward, while the faint thunder of artillery marked the horizon. Inside, the nurses focused on the fragile space they controlled, determined to keep it steady despite the chaos beyond. The first rounds were always the hardest. Dressings applied in the night had to be changed, wounds inspected, and new fevers checked. The soldiers often met these tasks with clenched jaws and muffled groans, but a calm word or a gentle touch steadied them. The nurses knew that their composure mattered as much as their skill, and they offered both without hesitation. Supplies were thinner than ever. Bandages were cut into narrow strips. Iodine dripped sparingly onto cloth, and morphine was counted with painful precision. Decisions weighed heavily. Who needed relief most? Who could endure a little longer? Yet the nurses carried these burdens silently, never letting their patients see the conflict behind their eyes. Improvisation filled the gaps. Shirts torn into slings, crates broken into splints, pillows fashioned from bundled coats. Each solution was imperfect, but it kept the work moving forward. Hunger soon gnawed at everyone, but meals were delayed again. A scrap of bread, a swallow of broth, barely enough to quiet the stomach. But the nurses had long since learned to push food to the back of their minds. Energy had to come from willpower, from the shared knowledge that their presence mattered. By midday, the ward was full once more. Stretchers arrived in waves, carried by men with dust on their uniforms and exhaustion in their eyes. The nurses moved quickly, receiving each patient with quiet efficiency, clearing space, bending low to tend fresh wounds. Their rhythm became almost unbroken. Wash, bind, reassure, move forward. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the air inside thickened with heat. Flies swarmed, drawn to the scent of blood, and the nurses swatted them away with impatient hands. Sweat streaked their faces, yet their movements never faltered. They had grown used to discomfort. Survival depended on endurance. As the day pressed on, small moments carried them through. A soldier whispered thanks as water touched his lips. Another managed a faint smile despite pain. For the nurses, these fragments of humanity reminded them that their work was more than survival. It was a defense of dignity in a world consumed by war. The afternoon settled heavily over the ward, the canvas walls glowing faintly under the sun's harsh light. The air inside grew dense, clinging to skin and clothing, but the nurses moved steadily, their faces set with quiet resolve. Each cot demanded attention, dressings to be changed, wounds to be cleaned, fevers to be soothed. The rhythm of care was unending, yet each action held weight. For every patient was someone's son, brother, or friend. Their calm voices and steady hands became a fragile shield against despair. Supplies were again stretched thin. Bandages were boiled, dried, and reused until the fabric grew thin. Bottles of antiseptic carefully tipped to release only a few drops at a time. Morphine, nearly gone, was reserved for those suffering most severely. These choices carved deep lines into the nurses' thoughts, though they never let them show. Outwardly, they remained composed, their strength a medicine as vital as anything they carried on their trays. Improvisation filled every gap. Old fabric became slings, wooden boards became splints, pillows were shaped from folded coats. The nurses worked with what they had, their creativity born of necessity. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of material was seen as potential relief for someone lying in pain. Outside, the world roared on. The distant boom of artillery shook the ground, dust drifting into the ward with each tremor. Soldiers hurried past, their boots striking the earth in quick, urgent rhythm. These sounds pressed against the canvas, reminders that the war was never far. Inside, however, the nurses carved out a fragile space of steadiness, their measured movements refusing to surrender to chaos. Fatigue pressed harder with each passing hour. Muscles ached and eyes blurred. But the nurses leaned on one another in subtle ways. A nod exchanged across the room, a sip of water shared, a brief smile that carried encouragement. These small gestures wove a quiet bond that kept them upright. Hunger returned as well, but meals were again sparse. A crust of bread, a sip of broth swallowed quickly before another stretcher arrived. By early evening the light softened, spilling golden across the ward. In that glow, the harsh lines of suffering seemed gentler. Some of the soldiers spoke of home, their voices carrying fragments of peace into the heavy air. The nurses listened, allowing those words to remind them why they endured. But the respite never lasted long. More stretchers arrived, more wounds demanded care, and the rhythm began again. Their strength lay not in rest, but in persistence, in the steady devotion that carried them through another unending day on the front. Night descended over the camp with a chill that seeped through every gap in the canvas. Lanterns flickered to life, their warm glow casting long swaying shadows across the crowded ward. The shift from day to night did not bring silence, only a different kind of labour. Patients grew restless in the dark, their pains sharper, their fears louder. Some cried out suddenly from dreams they could not escape, while others lay awake, staring into the dim light with hollow eyes. The nurses moved quietly among them, steady in their steps, soft in their voices. Comfort at night was often less about medicine and more about presence. A cool cloth pressed to a fevered brow, a whispered word of reassurance, a hand held until the soldier's breathing eased. These became the true language of care. The rhythm was slower than in the frantic rush of day, yet no less exhausting. Each call for help, no matter how small, was answered with the same patience. Supplies were thin, as always. Bandages had been boiled and reused so many times that the fabric frayed at the edges. The lantern light revealed bottles of antiseptic nearly drained, each drop precious. Morphine, locked carefully away, was given only when absolutely necessary. Every decision weighed heavily, yet the nurses bore it silently, unwilling to let their patients see the burden they carried. Between tasks, moments of quiet solidarity passed among the nurses. One offered another a sip of water, another adjusted a lantern so her colleague could see more clearly. These gestures, small as they were, carried them through the long hours. They leaned on each other not with words but with presence, a silent reminder that none of them bore the weight alone. Outside, the camp stirred with its own uneasy rhythm. Boots crunched against gravel, guards spoke in hushed tones, and the occasional growl of distant artillery rolled across the earth like thunder. The sounds seeped into the ward, reminders that safety was fragile, but inside the nurses maintained their calm. Their steadiness created a barrier as real as any wall. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion became a constant companion. Eyes stung, hands trembled from overuse, and every step grew heavier. Yet the nurses pressed forward, answering calls, tightening dressings, offering water. Their strength was not found in bursts of energy, but in the unbroken chain of small, steady acts. Toward dawn, when the lantern flames burned low and the night stretched thin, the ward carried a fragile stillness. The nurses knew it would not last. The day would bring new waves of wounded, but for that brief, suspended moment, their persistence had held. Lives had been carried through the night, and that was enough to give meaning to every weary step. Dawn crept slowly across the camp, the first grey light filtering through the thin canvas walls. The ward stirred with uneasy movement as patients shifted in their cots, some groaning softly, others whispering half-formed words from restless dreams. For the nurses, morning began not with rest, but with duty. They rose stiffly from narrow cots, tied their aprons with tired hands, and stepped immediately into the rhythm of care. The first rounds of the day were always the most demanding. Bandages that had held through the night needed to be replaced, wounds examined, fevers checked with careful hands. Soldiers often braced themselves, teeth clenched against the pain of fresh dressings. The nurses worked steadily, their calm voices guiding the men through the discomfort. Even in exhaustion, they understood the power of tone. The reassurance of a gentle word could steady a soldier's heart as much as medicine steadied his body. Outside, trucks rattled along muddy roads, their engines growling as they carried supplies and men toward the front. Orders were shouted across the camp, boots struck against gravel, and in the distance the muffled rumble of artillery rolled across the horizon. Those sounds seeped into the ward, constant reminders that the war pressed close, but inside the nurses focused only on the fragile space they controlled. Supplies were once again stretched thin. Cloth was cut smaller and boiled again for reuse, bottles of iodine tipped carefully to spare every drop. Morphine remained locked away, measured and rationed with painful precision. Each decision weighed heavily, but the nurses carried the burden quietly, unwilling to show uncertainty when steadiness was most needed. Improvisation filled the gaps, shirts torn into strips, coats folded into makeshift pillows, wooden boards fashioned into splints. These acts of resourcefulness were not grand, but they mattered deeply to the men lying in pain. Food arrived late, as always. A crust of bread, a tin cup of weak broth, passed quickly among the staff. Hunger was constant, but it was ignored. What mattered more was conserving strength for the endless stream of tasks ahead. Among the nurses, encouragement flowed in silence. A smile exchanged across the ward, a hand resting briefly on a shoulder, a tin cup of water passed without words. These gestures held them together when fatigue threatened to unravel them. By midday, the ward was full once more. Stretchers arrived in waves, carried by soldiers whose uniforms were torn and caked with mud. The nurses moved swiftly, guiding orderlies, clearing space, bending low to tend each new wound. Their rhythm was unbroken, their voices steady, their hands precise. And though the day stretched long ahead, they pressed forward, each small act of care a quiet defiance against the tide of suffering that never seemed to end. The afternoon sun bore down mercilessly, its heat pressing through the canvas until the air inside the ward felt thick and heavy. Sweat clung to every surface, soaking through uniforms and aprons, but the nurses carried on with steady hands. The ward pulsed with quiet urgency, each cot demanding attention, each patient pulling them further into the endless rhythm of care. Their voices remained calm and measured, the tone itself a form of medicine that steadied frightened hearts. The men spoke more during these hours, perhaps to distract themselves from pain. Some described fields and rivers from home, their words painting pictures of peace far removed from the battlefield. Others asked after comrades, their voices wavering with fear of answers they might not want to hear. The nurses listened patiently, offering comfort through presence more than promises. They had learned that simply being there, calm and attentive, was often enough to quiet the storm inside a soldier's mind. Supplies were again dwindling. Bandages boiled and reused showed signs of wear, antiseptic bottles nearly empty, morphine saved for only the most desperate cases. Each drop, each strip of cloth, was measured with precision. Improvisation filled the gaps. Fabric torn from worn clothing, splints shaped from broken boards, water carried in heavy pails to wash wounds. The nurses adapted instinctively, their creativity as vital as their training. Outside, the war pressed on with its own rhythm. Trucks roared by, boots struck the earth in hurried marches, and the occasional thud of distant artillery rolled across the horizon. Dust drifted in with every gust of wind, coating the air and the cots alike. Yet inside, the nurses built a fragile shield of steadiness, their calm movements pushing back against the chaos beyond. Fatigue deepened as the afternoon stretched forward. Hands trembled slightly from overuse, shoulders ached from lifting, and eyes burned from the constant focus. But the nurses leaned on one another silently, passing water, sharing brief smiles, exchanging nods of understanding. These small gestures stitched them together, a quiet bond that kept them moving when their strength threatened to falter. By early evening the sunlight softened, slanting gold through the gaps in the canvas. For a brief moment the ward felt gentler, bathed in a light that seemed almost forgiving. The soldiers spoke more softly, some even managing faint laughter that carried through the heavy air. The nurses listened, allowing the sound to settle into their hearts, a reminder of why they endured. But the respite was short-lived. Soon, more stretchers arrived, carried by weary men from the front, and the rhythm began again. Steady hands, calm voices, quiet strength against the endless tide of suffering. Night descended once more, bringing with it a chill that crept through the seams of the canvas and settled into tired bones. The ward, lit by rows of lanterns, glowed in soft, uneven light. Shadows stretched across the cots, rising and falling with every flicker of flame. For the nurses, the change from day to night did not ease their work. It only shifted its tone. Patients grew restless in the dark, their whispers carrying fragments of fear, memories of home, or cries from dreams they could not escape. Some reached out blindly, hands searching for reassurance, while others pressed photographs to their chests, as if holding on to another life. The nurses answered each call, their steps soft, their words calm. A steady hand placed gently on a shoulder, a cloth pressed to a fevered forehead, a sip of water offered in silence. These became the language of comfort when words fell short. Supplies, already thin, felt even scarcer at night. The nurses worked carefully, measuring each drop of medicine, reusing cloths until the fabric wore thin, boiling water again and again to keep instruments clean. They improvised constantly, turning scraps into bandages and broken wood into supports. In the lantern light their work was slower but just as deliberate, every action guided by patience and care. The bond among the nurses grew strongest during these hours. Exhaustion pressed heavily on them all, yet they leaned on each other without speaking. One adjusted a lantern for her colleague, another slipped a piece of bread into waiting hands, another poured half her water into a tin cup to share. These small gestures carried a quiet strength, a reminder that none of them stood alone. Outside, the camp stirred faintly. The crunch of boots on gravel, the murmur of guards, and the occasional low thunder of artillery seeped through the canvas walls. The war never truly slept, and its presence pressed against the ward like an invisible weight. Yet inside, the nurses held firm, creating a fragile sanctuary with their steadiness. As midnight passed, the work grew heavier. Fevers spiked, wounds reopened, and men called out in pain. The nurses moved from bed to bed, steady and unbroken, even when their own bodies longed for rest. Fatigue clouded their minds, but habit and determination carried them forward. By the time dawn edged close, their eyes burned and their hands trembled, yet the rhythm of care remained unbroken. They had carried the ward through another night, each quiet act a small defiance against despair, each step a promise that no one would face the darkness alone. Dawn returned in muted grey, seeping through the canvas and casting long streaks of pale light across the crowded ward. The nurses rose stiffly, their few hours of rest leaving them only half restored. They tied their aprons with practised motions and stepped immediately back into the rhythm that defined their lives. Morning always brought the heaviest tasks, removing bandages that had hardened overnight, washing wounds that burned at the touch of cold water, checking pulses that fluttered faintly under the skin. Soldiers braced themselves, gripping the edges of their cots or whispering prayers, and the nurses guided them through the pain with steady voices. Their calmness, repeated countless times each day, became a medicine of its own. Outside, trucks rumbled past, their wheels grinding into the mud as supplies moved toward the front. Orders were shouted, boots struck the earth in hurried rhythm, and the distant thunder of artillery rolled steadily across the horizon. The war pressed close, its presence unshakable, but inside the ward the focus remained narrow. One patient, one wound, one fragile life at a time. Food came late and was sparse as always. A crust of bread softened in broth, a tin cup of weak coffee passed quickly from hand to hand. Hunger was constant, but it was folded into the background, endured without complaint. Strength came not from food, but from the determination to keep moving. Supplies were once again dwindling. The nurses stretched what little they had, cutting bandages thinner, boiling cloth until it wore thin, rationing antiseptic drop by drop. Morphine, kept locked carefully away, was used with agonizing restraint. Each choice weighed heavily, but their faces never betrayed the burden. Instead, they moved with a calm that steadied both patient and colleague alike. By midday, the ward grew heavy with heat. Flies buzzed incessantly, landing where they could, and the nurses brushed them away with impatient hands. Sweat streaked across faces and soaked through aprons, but the rhythm never broke. Each cot required attention. Each soldier needed to know he had not been forgotten. Small victories carried the nurses forward. A fever lowered, a soldier managed to drink on his own. Another whispered gratitude with a faint smile. These moments, fragile and fleeting, gave meaning to every weary step. The day stretched endlessly, yet they pressed on, guided by the quiet conviction that their presence mattered. For the nurses, survival was not only about tending wounds, it was about defending humanity in a place where so much of it was being lost. The afternoon arrived with a heaviness that settled over the ward like a weight. The canvas walls trapped the warmth of the sun, turning the air stifling and close. Every breath carried the mingled sense of antiseptic, sweat and damp earth. The nurses moved steadily despite it. Their sleeves rolled high, their hands never still. Each cot held its own demands. Dressings to be changed, water to be offered, fevers to be cooled with cloths dipped in basins. The rhythm of work was endless, but the meaning of each act never diminished. Soldiers, weary and wounded, often spoke more freely in the afternoon light. Some told stories of their childhoods, their voices soft and distant, as though they could see the fields or rivers in their minds. Others fell silent, their energy drained, yet their eyes followed the nurses with a quiet trust. That trust was unspoken but deeply felt, and it gave the women strength to keep moving, even when fatigue pressed heavily on their bodies. Supplies were again stretched to the limit. Bandages, boiled and reused, had grown thin. Bottles of iodine clinked nearly empty when lifted. Morphine, reserved for the gravest cases, was rationed with painful care. Improvisation filled the gaps. Cloth torn from worn shirts, splints carved from scrap wood, pillows shaped from folded coats. Nothing was wasted. Necessity turned every object into a tool of survival. Outside, the world of war pressed closer. The rumble of artillery grew sharper, shaking dust loose from the rafters. Trucks roared by, their engines echoing through the camp while boots struck the ground in hurried cadence. These sounds seeped into the ward, constant reminders that danger was never far. Yet inside, the nurses created a fragile steadiness with their calm voices and deliberate movements. Fatigue grew heavier with every passing hour. Shoulders ached from lifting, eyes blurred from endless focus. Hands carried the memory of every wound touched. Still, the nurses leaned quietly on one another. A nod, a faint smile, or a cup of water passed silently from hand to hand became gestures of survival. They knew that endurance was not found alone, but in the bonds they shared. Toward evening, the harsh light softened, spilling golden across the ward. For a brief time, the atmosphere grew gentler. Soldiers spoke more softly, sometimes even managing a faint laugh. The nurses paused for a heartbeat, letting the sound sink in, a reminder of the humanity they worked so fiercely to protect. But soon the stretchers returned, carried in on weary shoulders, and the rhythm of urgency began again. The day pressed forward, and the nurses braced themselves, sleeves rolled, hands steady, ready for whatever the night would bring. Night once again wrapped itself around the camp, bringing a damp chill that crept through every seam of the ward. Lanterns flickered to life, their flames casting trembling light across the crowded rows of cots. The air carried a hush, broken only by the soft groans of patients, the scrape of stools against the floor, and the steady footsteps of nurses moving between beds. Darkness changed the rhythm of the ward but never slowed it. In those hours, pain often felt sharper, fevers more dangerous, and fear harder to silence. Some soldiers muttered in their sleep, trapped in dreams of battle, while others reached out blindly for a hand to hold. The nurses answered with quiet constancy, leaning close to offer comfort through touch or soft words. In the stillness of night, presence itself became the strongest form of care. Supplies were again rationed with painful precision. Cloths that had been boiled and reused grew thin at the edges. Bottles of antiseptic rattled nearly empty, and every drop of morphine was measured with unshakable care. Improvisation filled the silence. Strips of fabric shaped into bindings, wood carved into splints, coats folded into pillows. Each act of resourcefulness was another defiance against scarcity. The nurses leaned on one another in subtle ways. One would adjust a lantern for her colleague, another would share half of a crust of bread, another would pass a cup of weak coffee across the ward. No words were needed, the gestures themselves were enough. These bonds, woven quietly in the shadows, carried them through the long hours. Outside, the world never truly slept. The crunch of boots on gravel, the murmur of guards, and the low rumble of distant artillery seeped through the canvas walls. The nurses felt it all, but they refused to let the weight of war break the calm inside. Their steadiness became a fragile shield, protecting the ward from despair. As midnight passed, exhaustion deepened. Hands trembled slightly, eyes burned with strain, and every step felt heavier. Still, the nurses pressed forward, moving from bed to bed with the same careful rhythm. Each sip of water offered, each cloth pressed a fever, each bandage tightened carried meaning. Their strength was not loud or dramatic. It was the quiet persistence that refused to falter. Toward dawn, the lantern flames grew faint, their light dimming as the sky outside began to pale. The ward held a fragile stillness, as though suspended between night and morning. The nurses, weary but unbroken, carried their patients through another night, one steady step at a time. Dawn seeped slowly into the ward, painting the canvas walls with pale grey light. The nurses stirred from narrow cots where they had stolen fragments of rest, their bodies stiff, their minds heavy with fatigue. Yet the rhythm of duty allowed no delay. Aprons were tied, sleeves rolled, and immediately the morning rounds began. Each bed demanded attention. Bandages hardened overnight were loosened and replaced. Wounds were washed with water carried in heavy buckets. fevers checked with steady hands. The soldiers braced themselves, some gripping their cots, others clenching their teeth. Through it all, the nurses' calm voices guided them forward, anchoring them to something steady in the storm of pain. Outside, the day awakened with noise. Trucks rattled over muddy ground, their engines straining under loads of supplies. Boots struck earth in hurried rhythm, orders were barked, and the low thunder of artillery rolled ceaselessly in the distance. These sounds pressed at the canvas walls, but inside the ward the focus narrowed. One patient, one wound, one fragile moment at a time. Food was scarce, as always. A slice of bread, softened in broth, was passed quickly from hand to hand. Hunger became part of the background, ignored in favour of strength to carry on. Energy came not from meals, but from resolve, from the quiet understanding that their presence mattered more than their comfort. Supplies were again stretched thin. Cloth boiled and reused grew fragile, bottles of antiseptic nearly dry, morphine counted with painful restraint. Every choice carried weight. Who needed immediate relief? Who could endure a little longer? The nurses bore these decisions silently, unwilling to let their patients sense the heaviness that pressed so sharply on their hearts. Improvisation became habit. Old shirts were torn into slings, crates broken into splints, coats folded into pillows. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap became a tool of survival. By midday, the ward swelled once more with new stretchers carried in from the front. Dust and mud clung to uniforms, groans filled the air, and the nurses moved quickly, guiding orderlies, clearing space, bending low to tend fresh wounds. Their movements were precise, their words steady, their presence unshaken even when exhaustion gnawed at every muscle. Small moments gave meaning to the endless strain. A fever lowered, a soldier managed a faint smile, another whispered thanks with trembling lips. These fragments of humanity reminded the nurses why they endured. The day stretched endlessly, yet they pressed forward, sleeves rolled, hands steady, hearts resolved to carry their patients through another cycle of suffering and survival. The afternoon sun pressed heavily against the ward, turning the air close and stifling beneath the canvas. Sweat clung to brows and dampened aprons, yet the rhythm of duty never faltered. The nurses moved steadily from cot to cot, their hands swift but gentle, their voices calm and measured. Every patient carried his own story, and every wound demanded its own kind of attention. One soldier clutched a small medal in his hand, gripping it as if it might anchor him to life. Another whispered prayers through clenched teeth as dressings were changed. The nurses listened when they could, their presence steady, their words quiet and reassuring. The human need for comfort was as real as the need for medicine, and both were given in equal measure. Supplies were again strained thin, bandages boiled and reused, frayed at the edges. Bottles of antiseptic rattled nearly empty, and the remaining vials of morphine were measured with agonizing care. Each choice weighed heavily. To ease one man's pain meant saving less for the next. Yet the nurses bore these decisions silently, never letting their patients see the conflict behind their calm expressions. Improvisation became survival. Strips of cloth cut from worn uniforms were folded into dressings. Splints were carved from broken crates. Coats were stacked and tied to form pillows. Every scrap mattered. Every object became a tool of care. Outside, the camp pulsed with urgency. Orders were shouted, engines growled, boots struck the earth in hurried rhythm. Occasionally the deep boom of artillery rolled across the distance, shaking dust loose from the rafters. The war pressed in from every side, yet within the ward the nurses carved out a fragile sense of steadiness. Fatigue deepened as the hours passed. Shoulders ached from lifting, hands trembled from overuse, and eyes blurred with the strain of endless focus. Yet among the nurses silent support passed between them. A nod, a faint smile, a sip of water shared without words. These gestures kept them upright. By early evening, the harsh light softened into gold, painting the ward with a gentler glow. The soldiers, too, softened in that light. Some managed to laugh faintly at shared memories. Others spoke quietly of home. The nurses listened, letting those fragments of humanity carry them forward. Then the stretchers arrived again, new voices of pain filling the ward, and the rhythm of care began anew. The day pressed on, and the nurses braced themselves once more, sleeves rolled, hands steady, ready to meet whatever suffering came next. Night closed over the camp like a heavy curtain, bringing with it the chill of damp air and the distant murmur of guns along the horizon. Inside the ward, lanterns flickered to life, their glow soft but unsteady, shadows bending across the rows of cots. The day's heat faded, yet exhaustion lingered in every step. For the nurses, evening was not a pause but another long stretch of endurance. Soldiers stirred uneasily as the darkness deepened. Some muttered through dreams, calling out names of family or comrades, while others stared wide-eyed into the dim light, unable to escape the memories that haunted them. The nurses moved quietly among them, answering each call with patience. A sip of water offered in silence, a cloth pressed to a fevered brow, a hand held until trembling eased. These simple acts became the strongest comforts the night could hold. Supplies were scarce once more. Cloth bandages, reused beyond their limit, frayed with every touch. Antiseptic was measured by drops, its sharp scent lingering faintly in the air. Morphine, carefully guarded, was given only in the most desperate moments. Improvisation filled the gaps, shirts torn into strips, coats rolled into cushions, pieces of wood carved into makeshift supports. Resourcefulness had become instinct, woven into every action. Between tasks, the bond among the nurses deepened. A brief nod, a lantern adjusted for better light, a tin cup of coffee passed from hand to hand. These gestures spoke louder than words. They carried each other through the long hours, their silent solidarity as vital as any medicine they dispensed. Outside, the camp moved to its own uneasy rhythm. Guards shifted in their posts, boots scraped against gravel, and the low rumble of engines drifted through the dark. The occasional boom of artillery reminded all within earshot that the war never truly slept. Yet inside the ward the nurses created a fragile island of calm, their steadiness forming a barrier against the chaos pressing close. As midnight passed, fatigue weighed heavily. Shoulders slumped, eyes stung with strain, and hands ached from endless work. Still, the nurses pressed on, moving from cot to cot, answering each need with unbroken patience. Their strength lay not in dramatic gestures, but in the steady persistence that carried them from one call to the next. Toward dawn, when the lantern flames burned low, and the first grey light crept through the seams, the ward fell into a fragile hush. The nurses, weary but unyielding, had carried their patients through another night. And though the war raged just beyond the canvas walls, inside the rhythm of care had held fast, a quiet defiance against despair. Dawn broke slowly, pale and uncertain, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over the scarred horizon. Inside the ward, the grey light spilled across rows of weary faces. The nurses, stiff from stolen fragments of rest, tied their aprons and began the familiar circuit of morning rounds. Each cot held its own demand, dressings to be changed, fevers to be checked, wounds to be cleaned. The rhythm was endless, yet each act carried weight, each patient a fragile thread in the fabric of survival. Soldiers braced themselves for the sting of fresh bandages, some biting down on cloth, others gripping the edges of their cots. The nurses moved with practiced calm, their voices low and steady, guiding men through pain with reassurance rather than promises. Their presence was constant, a quiet anchor in the storm. Outside, the world stirred with urgency. Trucks rattled past, engines straining under loads of supplies. Orders were shouted across the camp, boots struck earth in hurried cadence, and the distant roll of artillery carried like a heartbeat through the ground. These sounds pressed against the canvas walls, reminders of the larger battle, yet inside the focus narrowed to the single moment, the single life before them. Supplies were once again perilously low. Bandages boiled for reuse had grown thin and fragile. Bottles of iodine were tipped carefully, releasing only a drop at a time. Morphine, measured with painful precision, was reserved for the most unbearable suffering. Improvisation filled the gaps. Shirts torn into slings, crates broken into splints, coats folded into makeshift pillows. Nothing was wasted. Necessity transformed every scrap into an instrument of care. Food arrived late, meagre as always. A crust of bread, a sip of thin broth, a tin cup of weak coffee passed quickly between hands. Hunger pressed constantly, but it was pushed aside, replaced by the stronger pull of duty. Strength was drawn not from meals, but from resolve, from the knowledge that their presence mattered. By midday, the ward was crowded once more. Stretchers were carried in, mud and blood streaked across uniforms, groans filling the air. The nurses moved swiftly, sleeves rolled high, their hands sure even as fatigue gnawed at them. Their rhythm did not break. Wash, bind, soothe, move forward. Small victories gave meaning to the endless strain. A soldier whose fever had lowered managed a faint smile. Another whispered thanks with trembling lips. These fragile moments became anchors, reminders of why they endured. The day pressed on, heavy and unrelenting, yet the nurses carried their patients through it with the same quiet persistence. In each calm word, each steady touch, they preserved not only life but the dignity of humanity itself in a place where so much of it had been stripped away. The afternoon settled heavily on the camp, its heat thick and unyielding beneath the stretched canvas. Inside the ward the air hung close, filled with the sense of antiseptic, sweat and damp fabric. The nurses moved through it with steady purpose, their sleeves rolled high, their steps sure despite the fatigue etched into every motion. Each cot carried its own urgency, dressings to be replaced, wounds to be washed, pulses to be checked. The rhythm of care never slowed, each gesture deliberate, each act of comfort carrying meaning far beyond its simplicity. Soldiers spoke more openly in the afternoon light. Some recounted small stories of home, orchards in bloom, rivers winding through valleys, laughter that seemed impossibly distant. Others fell into silence, eyes fixed on the canvas ceiling as though searching for strength in its plain folds. The nurses listened when words were spoken, and respected the quiet when none came. Their presence alone was often enough to soften the fear that lingered in every corner of the ward. Supplies remained painfully scarce. Bandages, boiled and reused until threadbare, had to serve again. Bottles of iodine rattled nearly empty, and morphine was measured in agonizingly small doses. Each decision carried weight, yet the nurses carried it silently, their faces calm, their hands steady. Improvisation filled the gaps. Shirts torn into strips, wood carved into splints, coats folded into pillows. Nothing was wasted, every scrap pressed into service in the name of survival. Outside, the war pushed closer. The growl of engines, the cadence of boots, and the thunder of artillery seeped constantly through the canvas walls. Dust drifted in on every gust of wind, settling on cots and tables, brushed away only to return again. Yet within, the nurses carved out a fragile steadiness, their deliberate movements and quiet words a shield against the weight pressing from beyond. Fatigue deepened as the hours wore on. Shoulders ached, hands trembled from strain, and eyes blurred with the endless focus of tending wound after wound. But the nurses leaned silently on one another. A nod, a brief smile, a sip of water passed from one to the next. These small gestures stitched them together, sustaining them in ways words could not. By evening the harsh light softened into gold, painting the ward in a gentler glow. The soldiers, weary from both pain and memory, sometimes managed faint laughter that rose softly through the air. The nurses paused briefly to listen, letting that sound carry into their hearts before the next stretcher arrived. And when it did, they bent low once more, sleeves rolled, hands steady, ready to meet the unending tide of suffering with the same unwavering persistence that defined every hour on the front. Night fell quietly over the camp, the horizon bruised with smoke and faint firelight. Inside the ward, lanterns burned low, their glow soft but insistent, casting shadows that swayed with every movement. The air grew cooler, yet the heaviness of the day lingered, pressing into every tired limb. For the nurses, evening was not a time of rest, but of vigilance. The wounded stirred restlessly, some murmuring names in their sleep, others jolting awake from dreams they could not escape. A hand would reach out blindly, searching for comfort, and a nurse would be there, steady and calm. Presence itself became a form of healing. Quiet words, a cloth cooled in water, or simply the reassurance of not being left alone. Supplies were nearly exhausted. The nurses counted and recounted their dwindling stores. A few bottles of iodine, a stack of thin bandages worn soft by too many boilings, and morphine kept under careful lock. Every drop, every scrap mattered. Improvisation was constant, born not of choice but of necessity. Shirts were torn into strips. Wood from broken crates became splints. Coats folded again into pillows. Their ingenuity was as important as their skill, a daily act of defiance against scarcity. Among themselves, the nurses shared silent bonds. A cup of water passed into tired hands, a lantern adjusted to cast better light, a brief touch on the shoulder, small gestures that carried them through the weight of the hours. They rarely spoke of their exhaustion, but it was written in their faces, in the way they leaned on one another without hesitation. Outside, the war stirred with its own rhythm. Guards paced, boots crunching on gravel. Orders were carried in low voices, and the occasional thud of distant artillery shook the ground. These sounds seeped through the canvas, reminders of danger ever near, yet inside the ward the nurses maintained their fragile sanctuary. As the night deepened, fatigue pressed harder. Muscles burned, eyes blurred, and steps grew heavy, but the rhythm never broke. From bed to bed they moved, tightening dressings, soothing fever, offering water. Their strength was not in sudden bursts, but in the quiet persistence that refused to falter. By the time the lantern flames burned low, and the first hint of dawn edged across the canvas seams, the ward carried a fragile stillness. The nurses had carried their patients through another night, their persistence holding back despair one small, steady act at a time. It was this constancy, the refusal to yield, that defined their place on the front lines, even as the world outside thundered on. Dawn returned once more, pale and unsteady, its light creeping through the seams of the canvas as if reluctant to face another day of war. Inside the ward, the nurses stirred from fragments of rest, their bodies aching, their minds dulled by exhaustion. Yet they rose without hesitation, tying aprons and stepping back into the rhythm that defined their lives. Morning rounds began as always. Bandages hardened overnight were carefully loosened, wounds washed with cool water carried in heavy buckets, fevers checked with steady hands. Soldiers braced themselves, gripping cots, muttering prayers, or staring into the dim light as the pain washed over them. The nurses guided them through each moment, their calm voices offering a steadiness that medicine alone could not provide. Outside, the camp awoke in a storm of noise. Engines roared as trucks carried supplies forward, boots struck the ground in sharp cadence, and distant artillery rumbled endlessly across the horizon. These sounds pressed constantly at the edges of the ward, reminders that safety was fragile, yet inside the nurses held to their own rhythm. Their world narrowed to the lives before them, one fragile breath at a time. Supplies were nearly gone. Bandages boiled and reused were fraying beyond repair. Iodine bottles nearly empty. Morphine reserved for only the most unbearable suffering. Improvisation was no longer occasional but constant. Shirts torn into strips, coats folded into pillows, splints carved from whatever wood could be found. Nothing was wasted, every scrap pressed into service. Hunger gnawed at them, but food was scarce and meals small. Bread softened in thin broth, a sip of weak coffee passed quickly between hands. Strength came not from what they ate, but from the quiet conviction that their presence mattered. Among the nurses, silent support flowed in every gesture. A smile exchanged over a cot, a sip of water offered, a hand brushing against another in passing. These bonds, woven without words, carried them through when fatigue threatened to break them. By midday, the ward was filled again with new stretchers, mud-streaked and heavy with the wounded. The nurses bent low, their hands sure, their movements calm, their voices steady. They pressed on, sleeves rolled, shoulders squared, carrying both their patients and themselves through another endless day. And though the war raged endlessly outside, within the fragile walls of the ward, humanity endured, held together not by victory or power, but by the quiet, persistent strength of those who refused to let suffering stand alone. This was the life of a nurse on the front lines, unyielding, unseen, but essential, a steady flame in the darkest hours of war.